Now, this whole meritorious manumission policy is in effect, moving along at the same time, this control system. About 1852, a lady named Harriet Beach Stover wanted to write about it. So she then wrote about the whole thing. She interviewed a guy whose name was Henderson, what you all know as Uncle Tom. He then told her about the story. She wrote a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. But in that book, contrary to what most people think, Uncle Tom was not the bad guy. The bad guy was Sambo. And so I'm asking you all as my brothers and sisters, please in the future don't call a black guy who you know is worthless and trifling. Don't call him an Uncle Tom. That's complimenting him. Call him his real name, what he's entitled to, and that's a Sambo. Any black person any black person sells his own people out and will do them in, he is a Sambo. Now, what is a Sambo again? Going back to meritorious manumission in 1710, the whole conditioning process, the whole brainwashing system, the whole social engineering system says that you must teach black people to see the world through the eyes of whites. You must see everything through their eyes.
Hi, this is Dr. Joe Green, head pastor of Antioch Assembly Church in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, also the founder of the 2019 movement, and I want to share a couple thoughts with you. This is what many call Black History Month or Black Heritage Month, and what I found over the years as I study Black history and the history of relationships between people of color and whites in America. Recently, there has been this severe rewriting of history, and with the rewriting of history, there's a manipulation that's taking place among people of color, and especially how we relate to whites in America. You know, a lot of the stuff that's out there is meant to cause racial unrest. You know, the powers that be, the globalists, the Illuminati, for years have been trying to cause race riots in America. And I'm not saying there hasn't been issues between races, especially black and white, but when you really look deeper underneath the surface, you will see that there's a larger conspiracy that's taking place. You know, recently there was a shooting in Florida at a high school, a young man who was 19 years old who was identified as the shooter. You know, now they're attaching him to white supremacy. And whenever I hear these things, when I hear these mass shootings, I always go back to the false flag that the Illuminati has used throughout the years, throughout the centuries, not only in America, but around the world. You know, if you look at the Vietnam War, that was based on a false flag. It was called the Gulf of Tonkin, that they went in and they had people to pretend like they were Vietnamese and fire on Americans so that they could justify going into the Vietnam War. If you look at Nazi Germany, the same thing happened. They had people dress up in, you know, uniforms of opposing forces in order to get Germany to go into the war. You know, there's a lot of other things that have happened in America that have, you know, been found to be false flags. And a false flag is an orchestrated event that helps to push a certain agenda. So I mentioned the Vietnam War. The Illuminati, the bankers, wanted to go into Vietnam for the poppy. You know, if you look in the 1960s, they started to, you know, there was an influx of heroin into the United States. The poppy seeds in Vietnam were being used to actually produce opioid products, and they flooded the neighborhoods of America, especially people of color. And you know, throughout history. So I'm not going to go back into it. If you get a chance, subscribe to my YouTube channel. Look at some of the videos I've done. I did one on the opioid epidemic and in America, and I went through historical documents. I went through historical things that have happened to prove everything I'm saying. So I don't just come up with speculations. I don't come up with hypotheses that aren't based on information, real information, documentation, etc. It's a declassified documents that the United States government has. So all these things are there. And even in regards to race riots and racial issues between races, you know, there are people that are racist, and many of the ideologies, many of the things that have happened because of people behind the scenes orchestrating these things, because they're trying to keep racial unrest. Because what the Illuminati wants to do is, if they keep us fighting against each other, black versus white versus Hispanic versus Asian versus African, if they keep that infighting going, then we get distracted and we don't see the true conspiracy that's meant to destroy the population, the 99%ers that are the targets of the Illuminati. And, you know, like I said, this is all documented. You know, they've written in their books about how they want to overtake the world and bring in the New World Order. You know, this whole thing of white supremacy is part of the narrative that they are pushing. There really isn't any white supremacy. If you understand who the globalists are, who the Illuminati is, they're going to be using the same strategy against white people as well. There's 13 bloodlines of the Illuminati. And if you're not part of those 13 bloodlines, then you can either be a tool of the Illuminati or you're a victim of the Illuminati. And again, these are documented cases. I have, you know, all the things that they wrote and how they were going to, you know, bring in a new world order. If you look in Europe now, Europe's under attack. Greece, they almost collapsed the economy of Greece. If you look in Iceland, they tried to collapse the economy of Iceland as well, the international bankers. If you look in Sweden and all those other people that are being overrun by foreigners. In Sweden right now, there are what's called safe zones. And these safe zones are, or I should say no-go zones, no-go zones, where they have this influx of Muslim immigrants. And the police can't even go into these areas because of the violence, the crime. They've basically taken over these particular areas. So this is all part of the Illuminati's strategy to collapse world governments in order to usher in a new world order. And so what I want to talk about today is I want to talk about these strategies, because as I brought up the whole Florida school shooting thing, that I believe is a false flag for several reasons. I'm not saying that no one got killed. But what I am saying is that the powers that be bring in these false flags to push an agenda. I talk often about the Hegelian dialectic. So the Hegelian dialectic is an age-old strategy that they basically manipulate both sides of an argument to push an agenda. So in regards to these false flags, Charlottesville, the whole thing in Charlottesville with the Black Lives Matter, Antifa, and the white supremacists, that was a false flag. There was an eyewitness report, an account that saw people from Antifa and the white supremacy groups getting off the same buses because it's part of the Hegelian dialectic. So they George Soros funds Antifa. He funds Black Lives Matter. He's also a Nazi collaborator from World War II. And so he's one of the powers that be that fund these things to cause racial unrest. In Ferguson, Missouri, George Soros spent millions of dollars in order to get rioters to come in to riot in the streets. Again, this is all well documented. You just have to have your eyes open. So these false flags that they're using now, especially in regards to Florida, the school shooting, which I believe was a false flag event as well, it's to push an agenda. And one of the agendas that they have been pushing for the last several years especially is gun control, trying to revoke the Second Amendment of the Constitution. Or if they can't revoke the Second Amendment of the Constitution, they just want to put tighter controls over guns, because the tighter the controls are, the easier they will eventually be able to get rid of the Second Amendment altogether. And the Second Amendment, for those of you who don't know, is the right to bear arms. Now, why is the Second Amendment important? Because the Founding Fathers that put the Second Amendment in place, they did it to fight against governmental tyranny. And so they allowed for the citizens of the United States to have firearms, so that the government can't come in, a totalitarian government couldn't come in and to take over the masses, take control of the masses, right? And think about this. They just came from Great Britain, and we had the Revolutionary War where they were fighting against Great Britain. Great Britain was trying to overtax the people. They were trying to control the people. And so they allowed the citizens to have the right to bear arms to protect their own property and to protect their house and protect themselves. And so that's why it's so important that we understand what the Second Amendment is about, so that we can understand in whose best interest would it be that the Second Amendment is done away with. the liberals and the Democrats are really hot on this. The Obama administration was really hot on trying to put tighter gun controls, as opposed to the conservatives that were more pro-Second Amendment. And some of the conservatives don't want any limitations on guns as well. Now, right now we do have laws on the books. So, for instance, if I have a PFA, which is a protection from abuse order, if I have a PFA against me, I can't get a firearm. If I have certain violent offenses, then by law you can't buy a firearm. And there are regulations in place. As long as we go ahead and we uphold those regulations and those laws that are already in place, we should be okay. But as far as putting stricter gun controls is not the solution anyway. If you look at in the inner cities and the states that have the highest rate of gun homicides are traditionally the ones that have the strictest gun laws. So Washington, D.C. has some of the strictest gun laws in the country. They have high homicide rates. Chicago, Illinois. Chicago is some of the strictest gun laws. Michigan has some of the strictest gun laws. New York. These states have, Philadelphia has some of the strictest gun laws in the country, and they still have very high homicide rates, gun murders. So that's not the solution. But let me get a little bit deeper of what I'm talking about. Traditionally, black people have been conservative, and we still have conservative values, but there's been a shift lately because of the social engineering and because of the manipulation using the media and various sources. They have gotten black people in America to become more and more liberal, or to support liberal causes. So let's look at this, and especially in regards to the Second Amendment. But if you look at black families and the black community, we have had traditionally conservative views. So you think about, they did a study, and they have done studies over the years, and black people are considered the most spiritual people in America. When I say the most spiritual, I mean identify themselves as religious people, God-fearing, church-going people. We have traditionally been that in the highest of all ethnic groups. We're number one, and that's all the data and the research that has been done over the years. This is a recent one, and one that was done a couple of decades ago. Black people identify themselves as being the most spiritual people. If you understand that it was in the 60s with the liberal movement and the Democrats that their intention was to corrupt the black culture in order to control black people, because we got out of slavery and then we had Jim Crow. Jim Crow laws in the 60s and the civil rights movement, blacks began becoming more and more independent. The communities began to get stronger, and so a way to control the black population was to really push the liberal agenda, and that was done through the Democrats. Black people had been Republicans and had been conservative as long as we were able to identify with any political party. So it was in the 60s and LBJ that they really started to push this liberal agenda, and it targeted especially minority groups and people of color, and they began to corrupt the culture with liberal ideology. So in the 60s you had the free love and the sexual revolution. That was meant to corrupt the society and corrupt the morals of society. If you understand what the blaxploitation films were in the late 60s and early 70s, that was intentionally done in order to corrupt the black culture. Because like I said, black people were churchgoers, we were had strong family structures, and I'm not saying we were perfect or we didn't have our issues, but the principles that we stood for and we identified with were the ones that were conservative. So we were pro-family, pro-life, pro-God, church-going, God-fearing people. If you look at the civil rights movement, the foundation of that was the church. And even the other part of the civil rights movement through Malcolm X was through the Nation of Islam, which was a religious organization. So black people have the foundation of the black community was our relationship with God. And so liberalism has come in and attempted to corrupt that. Blaxploitation, the movies such as Superfly, Shaft,
The hottest trend in Hollywood, black movies to satisfy black audiences, a lucrative 40 to 50% of the box office intake. Call him Shaft, Slaughter, or Superfly, they're all one and the same. A black hero who always wins, fighting the mob or the man. In Shaft's big score, the superhero outruns, outshoots, outtalks the white mafia trying to take money from a child care center in Harlem. They don't make it, thanks, of course, to John Shaft. But while the superheroes can handle the syndicate, they're having a little difficulty with some black leaders who see the new wave of films as exploitation. They complain that since white production companies like MGM, Warner Brothers, and American International still get the big profits, it's nothing less than a modern version of the white-owned ghetto business, taking money out of the black community and leaving nothing in return. There is another complaint, the problem of image.
We have two images that we have always had projected about black folks in the movie. The inferior nigger, shuffling, head-scratching type, and that's in quotes. And the super nigger, which is the new kind of image being projected. But never or hardly ever the normal, ordinary black person or the ordinary hero without any psychedelic dressing added.
Innes claims that the superheroes like Shaft and Slaughter bear little relationship to the black experience. Slaughter seeks revenge for the mafia killing of his parents, and there is no problem he can't handle. The objection is the image of the slick, all-powerful hero portrayed for young people instead of a realistic figure of black manhood. Of a black James Bond, but Superfly is something else. Filmed in Harlem by an all-black crew, the hero is a cocaine dealer who succeeds in a massive dope sale and manages to elude the bad guys to get away. It is exactly the kind of image the black critics hate. A plot which enhances the racketeer hero, they say, only to bring further misery to the black community and justify the ghetto dweller's existence. Are you afraid of the dope pusher as hero for the black youth in the ghetto, for instance?
Well, aren't you?
You know, all these Foxy Brown, all these movies that they did in Hollywood, they called it blaxploitation genre because what they did was they tried to rewrite the black culture to make us less God-fearing people, less family-oriented, and so the drug dealer, the pimp, and all these other people were elevated in our culture. And that wasn't our culture. Not that there weren't people that were involved in that, but it wasn't the primary part of our culture. Drugs were flooded into our communities in order to corrupt, you know, so they found that the CIA and the FBI back in the 60s in California, in the 80s in California, and in New York, and the inner cities, they actually found that the powers that be were actually allowing drugs to come into our community because that was a way to corrupt our culture. There's Freeway Ricky Ross is a famous person, is a rapper that imitated him, but and Gary Webb was an investigative reporter that got killed. They said that he committed suicide, but there's a movie called Kill the Messenger, and it's based on a book that Gary Webb wrote, and through his investigative reporting, he found out that the CIA actually were behind the crack cocaine epidemic, you know, the Iran-Contra affair that happened in the 80s with Oliver North and the CIA, and where they were exchanging weapons with cocaine with the Iran-Contras, with the Contras in South America. It was called the Iran-Contra affair. So this is all documented. This was a part of the larger strategy, and you know, just another side note, when they were transporting cocaine into America, they landed it in Mena, Arkansas, where Bill Clinton was the governor. So Bill Clinton allowed the CIA, to come in and land their planes in Arkansas, and they would use that to distribute cocaine throughout the inner cities, especially, and throughout the nation. And then, of course, they made a deal with Bill Clinton and allowed him to become president. But anyway, again, these are all documented. The part about Bill Clinton, them making a deal with him, that's not documented, but everything else I said has been documented. That they were allowing cocaine to be transported in America, that's well documented. Oliver North actually got in trouble for being a part of this conspiracy. You know, Bill Clinton being the governor was part of it as well. So these are things that are well documented. Again, you have to do your research and find out what's going on in order to see that all these things have been happening. So black people have traditionally been more conservative. We've been pro-marriage. In 2008, they had what's called Proposition 8 in California, where they were voting on whether or not to allow gay marriage to be legal. And black people at a 70% clip voted against allowing gay marriage to be legal. They voted for traditional marriage between a man and a woman because we have traditionally stood for conservative principles. And in the 60s, that shift took place, and that was well orchestrated, and they continue to push. So many people that were identified as black leaders, the Jesse Jacksons, the Al Sharptons, et cetera, if you look at them now, even the Congressional Black Caucus, they stand for liberal conservative liberal ideology, even though the community is conservative. So they stand with gay marriage, they stand with abortion, they stand with illegal immigration, they stand with all these things that are more aligned with a liberal ideology, and that's intentional. So, and they're very ineffective. The Congressional Black Caucus and some of these leaders, the John Lewis, Maxine Waters, and these type of people, they really aren't helping our community, and they're getting more and more money where the communities are still starving that they serve. If you look at the liberal mayors, the black mayors in Baltimore, Detroit, Chicago, et cetera, they stand for gay rights, and they're for Planned Parenthood and abortion rights, and all these things that go against the values of our community, and our communities are suffering. These communities I just mentioned always have high homicide rates. In the inner city, they have high rates of unwed pregnancies. They have a lot of drugs, a lot of crime, criminal activity inside these communities, and all that's done to help to corrupt the culture. So let's talk about the Second Amendment, though. The Second Amendment historically has been an issue that African American people have stood for. So I'm going to give you some real black history, not the black history that they try to tell you, because what they try to tell you is that all blacks were slaves and all white people were slave owners. That's not true. Only 1.6% of whites were slave owners, and there were also even black people that owned slaves in the South as well. So, but again, they push the narrative for us to always be fighting white versus black. But some of you may or may not have heard of Ida B. Wells. So Ida B. Wells was a very historical figure in the black community. She was a investigative journalist. She owned her own newspaper in the South, and she was very much a civil rights activist, but a Second Amendment proponent. So civil rights and the Second Amendment have gone hand in hand. In her harrowing 1892 treatise on the horrors of lynching in the post-bellum American South, the journalist, suffragist, and civil rights champion Ida B. Wells established for her readers the value of bearing arms. Of the many inhuman outrages of this present year, Wells recorded, the only case where the proposed lynching did not occur was when the men armed themselves. So
Wells became a leader in anti-lynching and essentially almost invented it, I would say, because of a sort of terrible personal experience she had. It was a terrible lynching in Memphis in which 3 black men were killed, and one of them was a man named Thomas Moss, a local businessman as well as a local mailman who was a friend of Wells along with his wife. Wells is out of town when this happens, and she comes back to find black people fleeing Memphis, her friend Thomas dead along with 2 other men. She had been thinking that, she would live in the South and she would work to make it a better place. But when she looked at someone like Thomas Moss, who had been a devout churchgoer, taught Sunday school, invested in his own business, done everything that the sort of world said that blacks needed to do to get ahead, and then had ended up being lynched, she began to question whether you could really do anything in the South. She published an editorial that went essentially too far in saying all this, and a white mob stormed the office of the Free Speech and destroyed the printing press. Wells was fortunate she wasn't there, but the mob left a note basically telling whoever was printing the newspaper that they should leave town and putting a death threat. She ended up in New York, where she was hired by T. Thomas Fortune, the publisher of the New York Age, and led what was basically sort of the first anti-lynching campaign, where she identified lynching as a crime and was trying to push the government and social reformers to take action about it. Anti-lynching would become a major commitment for the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and it would also be a major commitment of black women's clubs and other civil rights organizations.
1890s, Ida B. Wells witnessed a lynching of a black man in the Deep South, and it shook her to her core because she stumbled upon it, and she was afraid for her life. So she became very much an anti-lynching activist. And so in keeping with her anti-lynching activism, she also pushed for the Second Amendment. And she said that there were times where mobs of white people wanted to lynch black men, and the only times that that lynching did not occur is when the black men had arms, were able to protect themselves. The lesson this teaches, and which every Afro-American should ponder well, is that when a Winchester rifle should have a place of honor in every black home, and it should be used for the protection which the law refuses to give. And so the Second Amendment wasn't just for Americans to protect themselves against the British ruling class or the British Army. It was also used during the Civil Rights era in order for black people to protect themselves, because it's useful for self-defense, which is why that was one of the amendments. Now, if you look historically, anytime a totalitarian government tried to take over, one of the first things that they do is they take away the firearms. If you look at Nazi Germany with the Third Reich, and Joseph Stalin, in communist Russia, if you look in communist China between 1933 and 1949, all of these totalitarian governments, the first thing they did was ban firearms for the citizens to own. And that was a way for the government to come in and take over and to control the people. In 1857, Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, in his Dred Scott versus Sanford opinion, he gave a panic warning that if free blacks were permitted to become American citizens, they might to keep and carry arms wherever they went. They might begin to keep and carry arms wherever they went. He was signaling his support for a disgraceful status quo within which suppression of the right to bear arms was depressingly common. Indeed, in the late 1970s, the history of American gun control was largely and inextricably taken from history. But it was part of the history of American racism. Long before Louisiana was a glint in Thomas Jefferson's eye, the French black codes mandated that any black person found with a potential weapon be not only deprived of that weapon, but also beaten for his audacity. So traditionally, it was the anti-gun activists that were with the Ku Klux Klan. They were the ones that were trying to keep black people oppressed. The lynching mobs, the people that were pushing for, were the lynch mobs in the South, were always thwarted by black people that bear arms. In the 1794 document of this these court cases, it says it had allowed but to the free white men of this state. So it meant that the only people that were allowed to have firearms were the free white men of the state. In much of America, this principle would hold for another century, emancipation notwithstanding. As Adam Winkler of the UCLA Law School noted, a movement comprising the Ku Klux Klan and those Democrats who sought to thwart the gains of the Civil War began with gun control at the very top of his agenda. So whenever the Ku Klux Klan and the Democrats, that the Democrat Party started the Ku Klux Klan, for many people that don't know, it was the Ku Klux Klan and the Democrats that whenever they tried to keep black people suppressed and oppressed, first thing they would do is push gun control legislation. And so this continued throughout history. Speaking in favor of proposed gun control act in 1968, the mayor of Chicago, Richard Daley, griped that Americans, especially the non-whites, are buying guns right and left. Someone, Daley thought, ought to do something, lest the riots that had been sparked by the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. turn into a minor insurrection. That year, Congress obliged passing a set of harsh restrictions on the importation of firearms and in effect outlawing the inexpensive foreign weaponry on most inner city blacks had come to rely on. It's difficult to escape the conclusion, the historian Barry Bruce Briggs argued, that the Saturday night special is emphasized because it is cheap and is being sold to a particular class of people. So they came up with laws trying to ban things like the Saturday night special, which many of you may know. It's a smaller caliber handgun, a .32, that a lot of people in the hood would carry. Even when I was a young person, some of the old heads in my neighborhood would have what they call the Saturday night special, because when they would go out, they would put one in their pocket or put it on their person as to protect themselves. Especially in some of these areas where where there was a lot of racism, and some of these people that would go out at nighttime, they were afraid for their personal safety, so they would keep a firearm in case they ran across someone who wanted to do them harm. In California, it's the Gun Control Act of 1968 was passed not to control guns, but to control blacks. This is with the left-wing writer Robert Sherrill. He put it even more bluntly in his classic anti-gun tome, The Saturday Night Special, in 1973. And he writes, the Gun Control Act of 1968 was passed not to control guns, but to control blacks. In California, a year earlier, legislators had been so vexed by the sight of armed Black Panthers protesting outside the State House that they passed legislation outlawing all open carrying of firearms. The first such ban in state history, and at a time perhaps the strictest ordinance in the country. Now, this was, if you guys recall the story of the Black Panthers, when the Black Panthers first started, they had a breakfast program for young people, educational program. So what they would do, they would make sure in the inner cities that the young kids got a hot breakfast. They would, they really push education. A lot of the Black Panthers in California actually were, they came together in order to run drug dealers out of their neighborhoods. And so of course they were targeted for extermination, and a lot of them end up going to jail. One in particular, Geronimo Pratt, who had been fighting his case for years. There was a lot of documentation that he was set up by the federal government. Even they have a thing called COINTELPRO that was made famous by the FBI and the CIA, but especially the FBI. So what they would do is they would take people from the community. So they would take black people and implant them into the Black Panther Party and other parties like that in order to find out what was going on, and also to sabotage their acts. Malcolm X was killed by people that was believed to be black people within the Nation of Islam or the Muslim movement. So traditionally, this is real history that we're talking about here. That blacks traditionally have been very much proponents of the Second Amendment as a way to protect themselves, protect their communities, and keep them from some of the atrocities that had happened against them. I know personally, in my family, my older family members, I used to hear stories of my grandparents and great-grandparents. A lot of them were living on farms and living in the country, and all of them had a shotgun or something like that. My pop-pop, when I was growing up, he always kept at least 1 or 2 shotguns in his house, and that was from his time of living in the Deep South, where he had to have one in order to protect his property and to protect his family. It's funny, but this is about Martin Luther King, and so just reading, I'm trying not to read all of the information. There's a lot of research that I have. I'm just sorting through it so I can make sure that I don't give you too much information, but I want you to check this out for yourself. The distinction between insurrection and self-defense was one that Martin Luther King Jr. himself insisted he observe. While violence as a tool of advancement, organized as in warfare, deliberately and consciously, was likely to invite incalculable perils, King held, violence exercised merely in self-defense, all societies from the most primitive to the most cultured and civilized accept as moral and legal. So before he really pushed his nonviolent movement, which was spearheaded by Bayard Rustin, who was the one who helped him to organize the March on Washington, Martin Luther King said that violence exercised merely in self-defense, all societies from the most primitive to the most cultured and civilized accept as moral and legal. So he believed that it was morally and legally acceptable to use violence just to protect your family and your property. Or, as the Mississippi farmer and civil rights leader Hartman Turnbow put it more with elan, by opening fire on Klan members who were attacking his home, I wasn't being nonviolent, I was just protecting my family, he said. Frederick Douglass responded, a good revolver, a steady hand, and a determination to shoot down any man attempting to kidnap them. The number of instances in which assailed blacks were required to defend themselves against captors, lynchers, and our unlovely array of people who wish them physical harm is nothing short of remarkable. So he attributed the use of firearms for self-protection as one of the ways that kept him from getting lynched, captured, or physical harm being done to him. Nicholas Johnson, civil rights movement activist, told NPR not long in 2013, blacks were human beings who were prone to respond to terrorism the way anybody else would. They could not be expected to remain faithful to their doctrine of nonviolence in presence of moral threats. Robust and organized defensive measures were an absolute necessity for any prominent black civil rights advocate who valued his or her life. Early on in his book, there is no reason for posterity to turn brave men and women into pacifists. Cobb should know he was there. I worked in the South, he recalled during his interview with NPR. I lived with families in the South. There was never a family I stayed with that didn't have a gun. I know from personal experience and experiences of others that guns kept people alive. Martin Luther King's home, Cobb recollected, was an arsenal. Not an uncommon thing for blacks who felt that their lives were in danger. Lou Hamer, the driving force behind the Mississippi Freedom Summer and a remarkable orator in her own right, always kept weapons nearby in case she needed them. She once wrote to a friend, I'm not going to read this quote because it's kind of provocative. She uses a racial slur against white people. She says, the first person who ever looks like he wants to throw some dynamite on my porch won't write his mama again. And of course, this is not condoning violence. I'm not encouraging people to go out and get a firearm. I'm just talking about historically, the Second Amendment was one thing that black people always supported, and it was something that they felt was necessary in these very racially segregated areas that allowed them to protect themselves. And it was the Ku Klux Klan who traditionally, when they went into an area to try to oppress and suppress blacks and do harm to them, that they would push for anti-gun legislation. Time and time, armed blacks successfully defended themselves against both private actors and state-sponsored terrorism, thereby chipping away at the perception that they were easily assailable and strengthening the movement that would eventually put an end to their oppression. Julian Bond, the SNCC's founder, has reasonably mocked the modern historical narrative as being more than Rosa sat down, Martin stood up, and the white kids came down and saved the day. Johnson and Cobb have put vital flesh on these bones. The nature of the rebels, eventually victory, is complex. The work of thousands of reformers, both celebrated and ignored. Within the true account, there is ample room for a slogan that gun manufacturer Colt popularized in its early brochures. Abe Lincoln may have freed all men, but Sam Colt made them equal. So this is Julian Bond, who was a very famous civil rights activist as well. This is about Harriet Tubman. Now, Harriet Tubman, of course, most of you know, she's going to replace Andrew Jackson, President Andrew Jackson, on the $20 bill. She has been described in this article as a gun Republican, and that many people may have a problem with her replacing Andrew Jackson. Biographer Kate Clifford Larson notes that Harriet Tubman was no stranger to firearms. Finding them a way to protect and reassure slaves, she shepherded to freedom in the North, perhaps making her a founder of the Black Lives Matter movement. Harriet Tubman carried a small pistol with her on her rescue missions, mostly for protection from slave catchers, but also to encourage weak-hearted runaways from turning back and risking the safety of the rest of the group. Tubman carried a sharpshooter's rifle during the Civil War. Harriet Tubman's image should remind Americans that gun control was a historical method to control and subjugate blacks. I'm going to read that quote again. Harriet Tubman's image should remind Americans that gun control was a historical method to control and subjugate blacks. UCLA constitutional law professor Adam Winkler writes to The Atlantic, indisputably, for much of American history, gun control measures, like many other laws, were used to oppress African Americans. The South had long prohibited blacks, both slaves and free, from owning guns. In the North, however, at the end of the Civil War, the Union Army allowed soldiers of any color to take home their rifles. Winkler also writes, and Winkler is this constitutional law professor from UCLA, and Winkler writes, the KKK began as a gun control organization. Before the Civil War, blacks were never allowed to own guns. During the Civil War, blacks kept guns for the first time. Either they served in the Union Army, or they could keep their guns or buy guns on the open market, where the first time there's hundreds of thousands of guns flooding the marketplace after the war ends. So they arm up because they know who they're dealing with in the South. White racists do things like pass laws to disarm them, but that's not really going to work. So they form these racist posses all over the South to go out at night in large groups to take those guns away. If blacks were disarmed, they couldn't fight back. Again, this is UCLA civil rights law professor, constitutional law professor by the name of Adam Winkler. In the case McDonald versus Chicago, McDonald, is 76-year-old African-American Army veteran living in the high crime area of Chicago, felt that the Second Amendment gave him the right to protect himself and his family with a gun, just as he once protected his country with a gun. The Supreme Court agreed with Justice Samuel Alito, referencing the 14th Amendment. Alito wrote, evidence from the period immediately following the ratification in 1868 of the 14th Amendment only confirms that the right to keep and bear arms was considered fundamental. To some, it is clear that the framers and ratifiers of the 14th Amendment counted the right to keep and bear arms among these fundamental rights necessary to our system of ordered liberty. So they attached the Second Amendment to your liberty as an American citizen that is protected by the Constitution. Harriet Tubman supported the Republican Party because it opposed slavery. She carried a gun because it protected the liberty and freedom of herself and those she delivered to freedom via the Underground Railroad. Just as Democrats sought to enslave and disarm blacks back then, they now seek to entrap them in high-crime urban areas run by liberal Democrats who seek to deny them and the rest of us the right to keep and bear arms. And that was from a recent article, documentary about Harriet Tubman's life. And so I want you guys to know what the real history is. You know, the liberals are rewriting history in a bad way. They're manipulating the minds of people of color, and they're taking us against our natural culture, which is more conservative, and also our rights that are protected now under the Constitution to bear firearms and protect ourselves. And so we just beg the question, who would want to take away that right other than someone who wants to oppress a certain group of people? And I think that just like I always say with the 2019 movement, is these strategies that were specifically targeting blacks are the same strategies that the powers that be will now use to oppress and to manipulate the masses in order to control them and in order to push forward their agenda. So have your eyes open. Don't fall victim to these schemes of the enemy. And until next time, just look under the surface. It's the issues are much deeper than most of us even understand. And know your true history in order for you not to repeat the atrocities that have happened in the past. Those who do not learn from history are destined to repeat it. Shalom to you, blessings to you, love, joy, and peace.
It's true that a Democrat President, Lyndon Johnson, shepherded the 1964 Civil Rights Act to passage. But who voted for it? 87% of Republicans voted yes to only 61% of Democrats who voted yes. In the Senate, 82% of Republicans favored the law, only 69% of Democrats. And among the Democrats who voted against it, Al Gore Sr., Robert Byrd, and William Fulbright. Robert Byrd would become majority leader of the Democrat Party. William Fulbright, Bill Clinton's primary mentor. The Republican presidential candidate in 1964 also opposed the Civil Rights Act. Barry Goldwater had been an enthusiastic backer of the 1957 and the 1960 Civil Rights Acts, both overwhelmingly opposed by Democrats. He was a founding member of the Arizona chapter of the NAACP. He hired many blacks in his family business and pushed to desegregate the Arizona National Guard. And he had a good faith objection to some features of the 1964 Act, writes Charon, which he regarded as unconstitutional. Goldwater was no racist. The same cannot be said of Fulbright, on whom Clinton bestowed the Medal of Freedom. Fulbright was one of 19 senators who signed the Southern Manifesto defending segregation. I've written about this at length myself, but I just want to repeat it. Okay, but didn't all the old segregationist senators leave the Democratic Party and become Republicans after 1964? No, just one, Strom Thurmond. The rest remained in the Democratic Party, including former Klansman Robert Byrd, who became president pro tem of the Senate. Former racists of both parties renounced their old views. Kevin Williamson of National Review points out Johnson himself voted against anti-lynching laws and poll tax repeals as a senator. And neither party has a perfect record on racial matters by any stretch. But it is a libel to suggest that the Republican Party, the anti-slavery party, the party of Lincoln, and the party that traditionally supported civil rights, anti-lynching laws, and integration became the racist party after 1964. The so-called Solid South Democratic voting pattern began to break not in the 1960s in response to civil rights, but in the 1950s in response to economic development in the Cold War. Black voters in the North, who'd been reliable Republicans, began to abandon the GOP in response to the New Deal, encouraged by certain activists to, quote, turn Lincoln's picture to the wall. That debt had been paid, said Robert Vann. In the 1940s, the GOP garnered about only 25% of Southern votes. The big break came with Dwight Eisenhower's victories. Significant percentages of white Southerners voted for Ike, though the Democratic Party remained firmly segregationist, and though Eisenhower backed 2 civil rights bills and enforced the Brown decision by federalizing the National Guard. They also began to send Republican representatives to the House. So these Republican gains came not from the most rural and deep South regions, but from the newer cities and suburbs. If the new Southern Republican voters were white racists, one would have expected that Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia would have been the first to turn. Instead, as General Alexander notes in The Myth of the Racist Republicans, the turn toward the GOP began in Virginia, North Carolina, Texas, Tennessee, and Florida. Eisenhower did best in the peripheral states. And Alexander concludes, the GOP Southern electorate was not rural, nativist, less educated, afraid of change, or concentrated in the Deep South. It was disproportionately suburban, middle-class, educated, young, non-native Southern, and concentrated in the growth points that were the least Southern parts of the South. The point is, folks, Rangel is peddling a libel, and Republicans should say so loudly and often. No, the Republicans didn't change places with the Democrats. Yes, the Democrats have rewritten history and have hijacked the so-called civil rights movement, which now attacks with a broad brush law enforcement, opposes the voting franchise by refusing to support efforts to ensure that only those who can vote will vote, and promotes massive big federal government socialism and redistribution of wealth, and all those things that are anti-liberty. Because that's what they are.